In the final winter of her life, Princess Diana walked into a place where almost everyone else was afraid to go. She was not wearing a royal gown. She was not surrounded by palace officials. She was not standing behind a podium delivering a carefully prepared speech. She was wearing ordinary protective boots, walking through an active minefield in Angola, because she believed something simple but powerful. Sometimes, one human being willing to look directly at suffering could force the entire world to pay attention. That moment became one of the defining images of her life, a princess walking through danger not because she wanted admiration, but because she wanted people to understand a danger most of them had never seen. Almost 3 decades later, on the birthday she never reached, her eldest son made a very different kind of journey, a quieter one, a more personal one, a journey not made through a battlefield, but through memory. On July 1st, 2026, Princess Diana would have turned 65 years old, a birthday that should have represented a completely different chapter of her life, a birthday where she could have been a grandmother, a woman with decades more experience, a global humanitarian figure with the ability to influence conversations around compassion, poverty, mental health, and human dignity. But history took that future away. Instead, the world was left with photographs, memories, and a question that has remained for nearly 30 years. How do you preserve the legacy of someone who never got the chance to grow older? For most public figures, time slowly changes the way people remember them. New generations replace old ones. The public moves forward. The attention fades. But Diana became something different. She became a memory passed from one generation to another. And in 2026, on what would have been her 65th birthday, Prince William appeared to make one of the most personal decisions of his life. He did not create a dramatic royal announcement. He did not organize a large ceremony focused on himself. He did not turn the moment into a public performance. Instead, he allowed something much quieter to speak, a photograph, a memory, a connection between a mother who was gone and a daughter who would never meet her, because this story is not only about Princess Diana, it is about a son who spent almost 30 years carrying a loss the entire world watched happen. A son who was forced to grieve in public before he was old enough to understand what grief truly. And it is about how that same son is now making sure his own children understand the woman behind the headlines, the woman behind the cameras, the woman behind the title, his mother, Princess Diana. To understand why this moment matters so deeply, you have to understand what Diana actually changed, because her legacy was never built only on royal appearances, was built on the moments where she stepped outside the traditional boundaries of what people expected from a member of the monarchy. She changed what compassion looked like, she changed what vulnerability looked like, and she changed what the public believed a royal figure was allowed to do. To understand why Britain still feels such a strong connection to Princess Diana, you have to look beyond the royal title. Because Diana's influence was never created by a crown, it was created through moments where she chose humanity over tradition. At a time when many public figures carefully maintained distance from ordinary people, Diana moved closer. She touched hands that others avoided. She entered places that many people ignored, looked directly at suffering instead of looking away. And that changed the way millions of people viewed the monarchy. One of the most powerful examples came in January 1997, when Diana traveled to Angola with the International Red Cross. The world watched as she walked through a real minefield wearing protective equipment and simple boots. Every step carried risk. Every movement was carefully monitored. But Diana understood the importance of that moment. She knew that many people had lived with the fear of landmines for years while the world moved. Children lost their lives, families were destroyed, communities were trapped by weapons, left behind after conflicts ended. Governments discussed the issue. Organizations released reports, but Diana believed the world needed to see the human costs, so she became the image. The photograph of a princess walking through a minefield reached millions. of people who had never paid attention before, and suddenly, a forgotten humanitarian crisis became impossible to ignore. Her message was not complicated. She was showing the world that behind every political debate were real people, real families, real lives. That same approach defined another important moment almost a decade earlier. In 1987, Diana opened the United Kingdom's first purpose-built HIV/AIDS unit at Middlesex Hospital in London. At that time, fear surrounding HIV and AIDS was everywhere. Many people believed false information. Many were afraid of simple contact. Patients were often treated as if their illness made them dangerous. But Diana challenged that fear with one small action. She reached out her hand. She shook the hand of a patient. No hesitation, no gloves, no visible, though, fear. That single photograph became one of the most important images of the AIDS crisis because Diana was not only visiting a hospital, she was changing a conversation. She was telling millions of people that illness should not remove someone's humanity, that compassion should not disappear because society was uncomfortable, and that was the pattern throughout her public life. She did not simply support causes. She changed the emotional language around them. She brought attention to people who were often invisible. The homeless, the sick, the forgotten, the vulnerable, and perhaps the most important people she influenced were not strangers. They were her own sons. William and Harry were raised inside an institution built around tradition, discipline, and emotional control. But Diana showed them another way. She took them outside the palace walls. She showed them people whose lives looked completely different from their own. She wanted them to understand that privilege was not something to hide behind. It was something to use responsibly. William was still a child when he visited shelters and hospitals with his mother. At that age, he may not have understood the full importance of those moments. But years later, those memories became part of who he was. They became part of how he viewed leadership, because Diana taught him something the monarchy had struggled with for generations. A royal figure does not become respected because people stand below them. A royal figure becomes respected when they are willing to stand beside people. That lesson stayed with William, and it became one of the clearest connections between his mother's work and his own future as king. But behind the public image of Diana, the humanitarian, was another story. The story of Diana, the mother. And that is where William's connection becomes much more personal. Because when people talk about Diana's legacy, they often talk about the princess, the fashion, the charity work, the photographs, the global attention. But William remembers something much simpler. A mother, a person who made him laugh, a person who comforted him, a person who tried to give him a normal childhood inside an extremely abnormal world. And then, suddenly, that person was gone. Princess Diana died on August 31, 1997 in Paris. William was only 15 years old. Harry was 12. For most teenagers, losing a parent is already an unimaginable pain, but William experienced that loss while the entire world was watching. Millions of people followed every moment, every photograph, every public appearance, every expression on his face. His grief was not private. It became a global event. The image of William and Harry walking behind their mother's coffin remains one of the most painful memories of modern royal history. Two young boys, two sons, forced to walk through a moment no child should ever have to experience. And for William, that day created a complicated relationship with public grief. The world expected him to be strong. The monarchy expected him to remain composed. The cameras captured every emotion, but nobody could truly see what was happening inside, because behind the official image of the future king was simply a 15-year-old boy who had lost his mother, and that pain would follow him for decades. For many years, William rarely spoke publicly about Diana, not because he forgot her, but because protecting her memory became something deeply personal. He did not want her reduced to headlines. He did not want her story controlled by public arguments. He wanted people to understand who she really was: a mother, a humanitarian, a person. And slowly, over time, William began finding his own way to keep her alive, not through dramatic statements, not through constant references, but through small, deliberate choices. The same kind of choices Diana herself often made, quiet actions that carried deeper meaning. For nearly 3 decades, William has carried Diana's memory in a way that feels very different from the way the world expected him to. He did not try to recreate her. He did not try to turn every public appearance into a tribute. Instead, he focused on something much more difficult, making sure people understood the person behind the famous photographs. The mother, the woman, the human being. And that became especially clear when William started raising his own children. Because for the first time, Diana's legacy was no longer only about a son remembering his mother. It became about a father introducing his children to a grandmother they would never have the chance to meet. Inside the walls of the royal homes, Diana's presence never disappeared. According to William, her photographs remain part of family life. Her name is spoken, her memories are shared, not as a historical figure, not as a former Princess of Wales, but as Granny Diana, a grandmother whose life ended before her grandchildren were born. In many families, grandparents pass down stories directly. They teach traditions. They share memories. They tell children about the world they experienced. But William's children do not have that opportunity. They cannot sit beside Diana. They cannot hear her voice. They cannot ask her questions. So William has taken on the responsibility of becoming the bridge between them. He has become the person who carries those missing conversations, the person who tells them who she really was. Not the version created by newspapers, not the version shaped by royal arguments, but the Diana he knew. The Diana who made him laugh, the Diana who protected him, the Diana who taught him compassion. And perhaps no child represents that connection more than Princess Charlotte, because Charlotte carries something unique. Her name, Charlotte Elizabeth Diana, 3 names connected to 3 generations of the royal family. 1 name honoring her grandfather, 1 honoring her great-grandmother, and 1 honoring the grandmother she never met. When that name was announced in 2015, many people immediately understood its meaning. Diana's story would continue, not through a title, not through a position, but through a child. A little girl who would grow up knowing that part of her identity was connected to someone the entire world remembered. Over the years, royal watchers have noticed small moments where Charlotte appears to carry echoes of Diana. The way she interacts with crowds, the confidence she shows during public appearances, the natural warmth she displays around people, the small gestures that remind observers of the woman whose name she carries. Of course, Charlotte is her own person. She is not being raised to become a copy of Diana, and William would never want that, because Diana herself was never interested in creating a perfect image. She believed people should be authentic. She believed kindness mattered more than appearance. And that is likely the lesson William wants his daughter to inherit. Not Diana's fame, not Diana's struggles, but Diana's heart. That difference matters. Because William understands better than anyone that being connected to Diana came with enormous pressure. He knows what happens when the public places expectations on a person before they are old enough to understand them. He lived through it, and he does not want his children to carry the weight he carried. He wants them to know Diana as family first. Not as a global icon, not as a symbol, not as a tragedy, but as someone who loved their father deeply, someone who would have loved them, and someone whose greatest achievement was not becoming famous. It was making people feel seen. That philosophy has shaped William's own work as an adult. When he created Homewards, his homelessness initiative, many people immediately recognized the connection to Diana, because the idea was not new, the compassion was not new, the motivation was not new. William had seen it before, as a child, walking beside his mother, meeting people who society often ignored. Diana taught him that homelessness was not simply a statistic. It was a human story, a person, a family, a life that deserved dignity. And decades later, William continued that same mission. But he did it in his own way. That distinction is important. William is not trying to live Diana's life. He is continuing the values she gave him. That is the difference between imitation and inheritance. An imitation copies the past, an inheritance carries it forward. And that is exactly what appears to be happening with Diana's legacy. It is moving from one generation to another, from mother to son to granddaughter. A chain of memory that survived despite everything that happened. Because Diana's greatest impact was never only about what she did while she was alive. It was also about what she changed in the people who knew her, especially William, the boy who lost her, the man who protected her memory, and the father who now introduces her to the next generation. So when the world reached July 1st, 2026, the day Diana would have turned 65, the significance was much deeper than a birthday. It was a reminder of the life that should have continued, the conversations that should have happened, the years that should have followed. It was the age where Diana could have entered an entirely new chapter, a chapter nobody ever got to see. She could have been the grandmother waiting at school gates, the grandmother sending birthday messages, the grandmother giving advice to William as he raised his own children. She could have been the older voice inside the family, the person who understood both the public world and the private pain of being royal. But history chose a different path, and that is why this birthday carried such emotion, because it was not only about remembering the past, it was about imagining the future that never arrived. And then came William's choice, a choice that reflected everything he had learned about his mother. He did not make the moment about himself. He did not create a spectacle. He allowed Diana's memory to stand quietly, the way she often stood for others, without demanding attention, without asking for recognition, just being present. And that may be the most powerful part of the entire story. After almost 30 years, William is no longer the young boy the world watched grieving. He is now the father, the protector, the person responsible for deciding what parts of Diana's story survive. And instead of allowing her memory to remain frozen in 1997, he has allowed it to grow, to evolve, to become something his children can understand. Because Diana was not only a woman from the past, she is part of the future William is building. A future where compassion matters, where people are seen, where kindness is considered strength, and where a grandmother who never met her grandchildren can still be present in their lives, not through a crown, not through a title, but through love. And perhaps that is the most meaningful legacy anyone can leave behind, to be remembered not because the world was forced to remember you, but because the people who loved you choose to carry you forward. And that brings us back to July 1st, 2026. A date that was supposed to be an ordinary birthday, a celebration of 65 years of a life that never had the chance to reach that point. But instead it became something much deeper, a moment where the past and the future quietly met. On that day, William did what he has spent nearly 30 years learning how to do. He balanced two worlds, the world of the crown and the world of a son who still misses his mother. For decades, Diana's memory existed in a complicated space. She was loved by millions, but she was also surrounded by arguments, explanations, and endless discussions about what her place in history should be. People debated her, analyzed her, defined her. But William's approach has always been different. He does not seem interested in controlling Diana's story. He seems determined to protect it, to allow her to remain what she always was to him. A mother, not a headline, not a controversy, not a chapter in royal history. A mother. And perhaps that is why this moment has affected so many people, because everyone understands the feeling of losing someone important. Everyone understands the fear that memories can fade, that voices disappear. That time moves forward. But William's actions represent something many families experience after loss. The responsibility of becoming the person who keeps someone alive through stories, through photographs, through small details, through the things only family members know. A favorite saying, a certain laugh, a personal habit. the little moments that never appear in official biographies. Those are the things that make someone real, and that is what William appears to be giving his children. Not a perfect image of Diana. A real one. A woman who had flaws, a woman who struggled, a woman who made mistakes, but also a woman who changed millions of lives because she cared enough to step forward. And maybe that is the most important part of her legacy. Diana did not become unforgettable because she was a princess. She became unforgettable because she made people feel that they mattered. The sick, the forgotten, the lonely. The people who believed nobody powerful was looking at them. She looked, she listened, she cared. And decades later, that same lesson continues through her son. William's greatest tribute to Diana may not be a statue. It may not be a speech. It may not even be a public ceremony. It may simply be the way he raises his children, the way he teaches them compassion, the way he reminds them that privilege comes with responsibility, the way he ensures that the woman they never met is still part of their family story, because some people leave behind possessions, some leave behind achievements, but the rarest people leave behind values, and values cannot disappear. They move from one person to another, from one generation to the next. A mother teaches a son teaches his children, and suddenly someone who has been gone for decades is still shaping the future. That is the quiet power of Diana's legacy. She never became a grandmother. She never watched William become the father he is today. She never held George, Charlotte, or Louis. She never had those ordinary family moments that so many people take for granted. But through William, she is still present. Through the stories he tells, through the lessons he carries, through the kindness he tries to pass forward. And maybe that is the closest thing to immortality any person can receive, not living forever, but continuing to influence the world after you are gone. On what would have been Princess Diana's 65th birthday, Britain did not simply remember a princess. It remembered a woman, a mother, a humanitarian, a person who changed what compassion looked like. And somewhere inside the royal family, a son quietly continued the promise he made years ago, that his mother would never become just a memory. She would remain part of the future. Because some legacies are not protected by buildings, not by titles, not by crowns. They are protected by the people who loved them enough to carry them forward. And nearly 30 years after the world lost Diana, her story continues. Not because history refuses to move on, but because the people she touched refused to let her disappear.